Welcome back. The Defense Department has a new deadline for contractors to comply with the ban on Chinese telecommunications products and services. The department and companies will have until September 30th now. Frank Kendall is Senior Fellow at the Center for American Progress, former Undersecretary of Defense for Acquisition, Technology, and Logistics. Frank, thanks very much for coming on the program. Is this a surprise to you that this deadline moves from last week to the end of the fiscal year?
Well, I don't know if it's a surprise, but I wish it had moved further. There are a lot of problems with this statute and its implementation. So I think what Ellen Lord actually has asked for, which I think is a year's delay, makes a lot more sense to me. The statute needs to be reconsidered.
Why so, Frank? Is it important in your view for these components to get out of the supply chain, or is this something that maybe is overstated?
No, I don't think the problem's overstated. I think the implementation's flawed. I fully support the objectives of the law. I think the intent is good. I'm not at this time party to the intelligence that convinced people that these particular companies were a problem, but I'm not surprised by that. The problem with the law is that it's very vague and it's very broad and it's subject to a lot of interpretation. It basically tells the government not to award contracts to people who are not compliant. Corporate lawyers all over the country are trying to figure out what this law actually means and what it's going to take to implement it. And there needs to be much more clarity about that. The guidance that's been put out so far, the GSA put out some implementing guidance. It doesn't really help all that much, unfortunately.
What would narrow the scope, would make it less broad, and what would clarify, what kind of language is necessary to clarify it so that it's not vague, as you stated?
I think that needs to be worked out between the department and the federal government and the Congress. Right now, it talks about use, the term that's not very well defined. It's not defined, really, and which equipment it applies to. It talks about things being essential. It also talks about the degree to which you have to go examine all your supply chain to see whether they're using any prohibited equipment or not. And there's that. Basically, the current guidance says that you have to make a reasonable inquiry. That's not specific enough. It's something short of an audit, supposedly, but what a reasonable inquiry is isn't defined. It's in the eye of the beholder. So which types of equipment specifically are included and which are not would be a good start. More details about what you have to actually do to be in compliance in terms of inspections or getting certifications from suppliers, those sorts of things. It needs a lot more work, and I think people should take their time to do that work. Again, I applaud the intent. I don't have any problem with that at all. I just think that people need to think through the practicalities of implementation.
Do you have any issues with the self-certification aspects of this, Frank?
Self-certification has some limitations, and I think it can be used. I think that's a perfectly reasonable thing to put in contracts, but by itself, it's not enough. People have to check, and they have to check enough that people are concerned about making sure those certifications are really meaningful. I think in general, we've had a problem with cybersecurity where we've allowed people to self-certify too much about meeting the NIST standards. And the solution to that is, in my mind, to do more checking and take action when people are not actually in compliance. And the degree of violation should dictate the strength of the action. But I think certification by itself is not enough. It can be part of an overall scheme to implement this.
You mentioned that the intent of this seems to be something short of an audit. Given the gravity of the national security challenge that's here, is it possible that maybe an audit is the right thing, or is that potentially too onerous for the companies to try to comply with and still be able to execute the contracts at a level that makes sense for the government financially?
It's asking a lot of contractors to audit their supply chain to thoroughly determine whether or not they have prohibited components in their supply chain. That's a big burden to put on industry. I don't think that that's necessary. I think they need to have enough documentation and enough evidence that people have thoroughly scrubbed their systems. And I think the government should be doing audits on a case-by-case basis to check to make sure that the compliance indications are valid and accurate, and then taking corrective action when that happens. You have to balance the cost of implementation here with the benefit that you're getting. There's some cases where, and I took a look at the comments people were providing. The interim rule is out for comment right now, And generally speaking, people are concerned about the definitions, what they really mean. They're not clear enough. They're concerned about things that would have a blanket impact on things like video cameras, which are largely coming from Asia, and are either from or include components from these companies, which could be entirely banned if it was applied. So I think a number of those concerns need to be heard. I hope that in response to the comments that come in, that there'll be an additional delay and people will go back and reconsider this, and maybe go renegotiate the statute with the Hill and get them to modify it so that it's more implementable.
Less than a minute left, Frank. Is there any room for nuance here in the types of equipment, or does it make sense to make this a blanket ban rather than saying this type of application might be okay to use a piece of equipment from China and this type of application's obviously not?
I think those details should be worked out. They should be looked at. I mean, there are cases like the one I mentioned where the consequence is much more severe than is intended, I think, and can be mitigated by other risk mitigation measures. If you're using security cameras, for example, they don't necessarily need to be connected directly to anything else in the information system that's being used. There are ways to kind of isolate them so that they're not a problem. Things like that can be done, and it should be allowed, and at least considered as people implement the detailed regulations that are ultimately going to be necessary.
Frank Kendall, thanks very much as always. Great to see you.
Always good to be with you, Francis. Thank you.